It was upon one of those bleak December mornings, when the fog clung low over the Thames, and the air carried the faint metallic scent of frost, that I once again found myself in the familiar warmth of Baker Street. A thin wisp of smoke curled upward from Holmes's pipe, forming curious shapes in the air as he reclined languidly in his chair, his grey eyes half-lidded yet unerringly alert. Outside, London moved in a muffled silence, disturbed only by the occasional rattle of a passing hansom or the shrill cry of a newsboy selling the Standard. Within, however, there was a peculiar energy that seemed to hum just beneath the surface of our domestic quietude. Holmes had been in one of his rare moods of abstraction, refusing both breakfast and conversation, when Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a card upon a silver tray. "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "He says it is of urgent importance." Holmes glanced at the card without rising. "Ah," said he in a tone of quiet amusement. "Colonel Archibald Fenwick, late of the Indian Army. The gentleman has travelled far this morning. His boots will tell us that much." "How can you possibly know?" I began, only to be silenced by the familiar raised hand. "The card bears the faint scent of damp leather polish, of the sort used in military quarters," said Holmes. "Moreover, the pressure of his handwriting reveals a firm and disciplined temperament, the hand of a man accustomed to command but troubled of late." Before I could inquire further, the door opened to admit the colonel himself, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a greying moustache and an expression that betrayed sleepless nights. His coat was dusted with frost, and the nervous twitch in his left hand suggested strain rather than cold. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice hoarse, "I have come because a most dreadful thing has occurred at my residence in Hanover Square. My niece, Miss Clara Fenwick, is dead." "Murdered, sir, in her own bedchamber." Holmes sat forward instantly, his eyes alight. "Murdered, you say? Scotland Yard is already involved, I presume?" "Yes. Inspector Lestrade arrived this morning. But the circumstances are most extraordinary." "In what way?" Holmes asked, steepling his fingers. "She was found," said the colonel, "in her room, locked from the inside. A single candle burned beside her, frozen solid in its holder, as though time itself had stopped. There was no sign of struggle, no mark upon her body. And yet," his voice faltered, "and yet the expression on her face was one of utter terror." A silence fell between us, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. Holmes rose, the familiar gleam of excitement already illuminating his features. "Watson," said he, seizing his coat and scarf, "it seems Christmas has arrived early, and brought with it a riddle wrapped in frost. Fetch your hat, my dear fellow. We go to Hanover Square." The hansom cab cut swiftly through the dense December fog, its wheels hissing over the damp cobblestones as we made our way toward Hanover Square. Holmes sat opposite me, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in concentration. I knew better than to disturb his thoughts when he fell into such trances. The rhythmic clatter of hooves and the muffled sound of London's early bustle filled the silence between us. When at last we arrived, the street lay hushed beneath a pall of mist. Gas lamps glowed faintly like amber orbs behind veils of vapour. A constable stood guard before a handsome Georgian townhouse of red brick and white trimming. The door opened before we had even mounted the steps, and Inspector Lestrade himself greeted us with a grim expression. "I might have known you'd turn up, Mr. Holmes," he said, tugging his gloves. "The colonel wired you, I presume." "Well, you'll find this one as queer as they come." Holmes inclined his head with that courteous detachment he reserved for the Yard. "I make no assumptions until the facts compel me, Lestrade. Lead on." We were ushered through a marble-floored hall lined with ancestral portraits. The air smelled faintly of extinguished candles and lavender oil. The colonel followed us, his heavy tread echoing off the stone, his face drawn with grief. "Her room is at the top of the landing," he said hoarsely. "No one has touched a thing since she was discovered." We entered a corridor carpeted in burgundy, the curtains drawn, casting everything in half-shadow. At the far end, a single uniformed constable stood before a door, his face pale. Lestrade opened it slowly, and a chill seemed to spill from within. The room was large but strangely intimate, its wallpaper a pale cream patterned with vines. A writing desk stood by the window, a half-written letter upon it. Beside the bed on a small table burned, or rather had burned, a candle unlike any I had seen. Its wax was solidified mid-drip, forming crystalline tendrils down the brass holder. The flame had gone out, yet the candle retained the exact shape of having been suddenly frozen in time. Holmes went straight to it. "Ah," he murmured, bending low, "this is most singular." He did not touch it at once, but crouched, examining the wax from several angles, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Watson, what do you make of it?" I bent closer. "It appears as though someone poured cold water over it, instantly hardening the wax," I said. "But that is absurd." "Quite," said Holmes. "And yet the absurd is often the mask behind which truth hides. Observe, the candle has burned nearly to its base, yet the wick remains intact and blackened only at the tip. Frozen at the moment of combustion." Curious, he turned his attention to the bed. Miss Clara Fenwick lay there beneath a lace coverlet, her features pale and peaceful, save for the wide eyes, which still bore that frozen look of terror the colonel had described. A faint bluish tint colored her lips. Holmes leaned over her, his movements gentle, precise. "There are no marks of violence," he said softly. "No signs of struggle. Her hands are loosely folded, not clenched. And yet, note this, Watson." He pointed to the underside of her left wrist. A thin, discolored line, scarcely visible, ran across the skin. "Some kind of ligature?" I asked. "Not quite. More likely the impression of fine silk or ribbon, something worn tight for a long period. Possibly a habit or an ornament." He moved to the window. Frost patterned the glass like veins of silver. He examined the latch, then the sill. "Locked from within," Lestrade said. "No sign of tampering. The chimney's too narrow for a man, and there's no second door." Holmes nodded, saying nothing. He knelt to the hearth, where the ashes of a small fire lay undisturbed. With a small poker, he stirred the grey dust. "Partly burned paper," he murmured. "And not common paper. This bears a watermark, H. Thorndyke and Sons. Expensive stationery. Someone burned a letter last night." The colonel stirred uneasily. "She was writing only yesterday evening," he said. "I spoke to her after dinner. She seemed troubled, distracted, but she would not say why. I retired at 10:30. At 8 this morning, her maid found the door locked and no answer within. We forced it and found her so." Holmes straightened and walked to the dressing table. A single candlestick stood there as well, unlit, and beside it a small glass vial with a trace of residue at its bottom. He held it to the light. "Watson." I took it, sniffed, and immediately recoiled. "Chloroform," I said. Lestrade grunted. "We thought as much. But there's no rag, no sign she inhaled enough to kill. The doctor said heart failure brought on by fright." Holmes's brows knitted. "Fright seldom leaves chemical traces of chloroform, Lestrade. This vial was used, but not on her. Observe, there's a faint smear of powder along the neck, consistent with handling by a gloved hand. Someone intended to make it appear part of the cause, but failed to understand the proper application." He moved again, restless, absorbing every detail, his gaze fixed on a framed photograph upon the mantel, a man in uniform, strikingly handsome, with a confident smile. "Colonel, who is this?" "My late brother, Major Henry Fenwick, Clara's father. He died in service 2 years ago." Holmes nodded slowly. "And her mother?" "Passed when Clara was a child. I have been her guardian since, and there were no suitors, perhaps." The colonel hesitated. "There was one, Mr. Alfred Tregoran, a chemist by trade. She broke off the engagement some months ago. I never approved of him." "A chemist," murmured Holmes, eyes narrowing slightly. "Interesting. Do you know his present address?" "In Bloomsbury, I believe." "I can send it to you." Holmes's expression darkened in thought. He turned back to the candle, his long fingers hovering above the wax. "Frozen candlelight," he said softly. "A locked room. A woman dead without a mark. And a chemist with motive. All the ingredients of a most curious problem, Watson." I followed his gaze. There was something eerie in that small flame eternally arrested. A symbol of life itself halted mid-breath. Lestrade cleared his throat. "If you ask me, it's straightforward enough. The lady took fright, perhaps saw something outside the window, and her heart gave way. The rest is just atmosphere." Holmes smiled faintly. "Atmosphere, yes. The very air is thick with it. And yet, Lestrade, even atmosphere leaves its footprints." He moved suddenly to the writing desk. His fingers brushed across the unfinished letter. "My dearest," he read aloud, "the ink has run slightly. She wrote this not long before her death. But note the indentation beneath. Watson, the pressure marks." She began another sentence, then thought better of it. He drew a small mirror from his pocket and angled it against the paper. The faint grooves revealed themselves in the reflected light. Holmes read slowly, his voice low. "I cannot forgive you for what you have done. The candle will burn tonight, and then all shall be finished." We stood in stunned silence. Lestrade let out a short whistle. "Suicide, then?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Inspector. This was not suicide. Miss Fenwick feared something or someone. The words 'the candle will burn tonight' are not metaphorical. They were an arrangement, a signal, perhaps even a threat." He looked toward the frozen candle once more, and I saw the familiar fire rekindle in his eyes. "Watson," he said, "we must pay a visit to Mr. Alfred Tregeron before the day's frost melts. There is much to learn from the man who understands how to stop a flame without extinguishing it." And with that, Holmes swept from the room, leaving the others behind in mute bewilderment. I hurried after him down the staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the cold silence of the house. The fog swallowed us as we stepped once more into the grey morning, and I could not help but feel that somewhere, in the heart of London's mist, the shadow of the truth waited, silent and watching. The fog still hung low over London as we made our way through the winding streets toward Bloomsbury. The cab's lanterns cast weak halos in the mist, the horses' breath rising in ghostly plumes before vanishing into the gloom. Holmes sat forward now, his eyes bright with that peculiar energy that seized him when his mind had caught the scent of truth. He drummed his long fingers upon his knee, muttering fragments of thought beneath his breath. "Frozen wax," he said suddenly, as though to himself. "An impossible temperature differential, unless aided by a chemical reaction. A chemist would know such things. You believe Mr. Tregeron responsible, then?" I asked. Holmes's lips curved slightly. "Belief, my dear Watson, is for the clergy. I deal in inference. The candle was no ornament. It was an instrument. The question is, for what purpose was it designed?" Before I could press further, the cab jerked to a halt before a narrow terraced house, whose windows glowed faintly behind drawn curtains. Holmes stepped out, his gaze sweeping the facade. "Number 38, he murmured. I observed the brass plate. A. Tregeron, MPS, and member of the Pharmaceutical Society. We shall find answers here." He rang the bell, and after a short delay the door opened to reveal a pale young man in a worn smoking jacket. His fair hair was dishevelled, his eyes red-rimmed, and there was something furtive about his movements, as though he feared both company and solitude. "Mr. Alfred Tregeron?" Holmes inquired. "Yes," the man replied, glancing between us nervously. "I am he. To what do I owe—" Holmes handed him his card. "Sherlock Holmes. You will forgive this intrusion, but it concerns the death of Miss Clara Fenwick." The blood drained from Tregeron's face. "Clara dead? Good God, how?" "That is what we are endeavouring to discover," said Holmes calmly. "May we come in?" The man stepped aside mechanically, and we entered a modest drawing room lined with books, vials, and a curious assortment of scientific instruments. A faint chemical odour hung in the air. Holmes's eyes roved over everything, missing nothing. Tregeron sank into a chair, pressing his trembling hands together. "She was well when I last saw her," he murmured. "2 nights ago. I went to return a book she had lent me. We quarrelled, but it was nothing serious." "What was the subject of your quarrel?" Holmes asked. The man hesitated. "It was about a discovery I'd made. A compound, an experimental cooling agent. She feared it might be dangerous. She had a delicate conscience, you see. Always thought of the moral side before the practical. An experimental cooling agent," Holmes repeated, his tone neutral. "You mean something that could lower temperature abruptly?" Tregeron nodded. "In theory. I was attempting to stabilize volatile reactions by sudden freezing. It was purely academic. I never—" He broke off, looking up sharply. "You don't believe I—" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "We believe nothing, Mr. Tregeron, until evidence dictates it. Pray continue." "I called upon her at Hanover Square," Tregeron said. "We spoke briefly. She accused me of being reckless, said I was tampering with things best left alone. Then she asked me to take back the small vial I had once given her. It contained a preliminary sample of my work. I refused. She insisted. When I left, she was angry. That was the last time I saw her." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A small vial. Was it labelled?" "No, she knew its purpose. And what exactly was inside it? Her compound derived from a crystallized form of ammonium chloride, blended with certain metallic salts," he said reluctantly. "When exposed to air, it absorbs heat with remarkable rapidity. It can freeze water almost instantly. But it requires an activating medium to function." Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "Such as candle flame?" The chemist looked startled. "Precisely. Heat triggers the chain reaction." For a moment, Holmes said nothing. His eyes were half closed, his face unreadable. Then he asked, "And how long does this reaction last once ignited?" "Only seconds. It draws all heat from its surroundings, leaving them cold, deathly cold." Holmes rose. "Mr. Tregarren, your invention may prove more consequential than you imagine. One final question. When you quarreled, did Miss Fenwick seem fearful or merely angry?" He hesitated again. "Both, but there was something else. She said she had received an anonymous note, warning her not to trust me." "I swear I knew nothing of it." Holmes's eyes flickered. "A note, you say? And she did not mention its contents?" "No, only that it came the night before I visited her." Holmes nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Tregarren. You have been most helpful. I suggest you remain at home for the day. You may hear from me or from Scotland Yard." As we stepped back into the foggy street, I turned to Holmes. "You surely don't think the man innocent? His own compound may have killed her. Unintentionally, perhaps," Holmes replied. "But motive and method must coexist, Watson. The man's remorse is genuine, yet his explanation introduces a new factor, one unknown to the Colonel or Lestrade. Someone else knew of that chemical and of its effect upon heat. The note, the candle, the locked room, they are all parts of a single design." We walked in silence for a time, the city's damp chill creeping into my bones. Finally, Holmes spoke again, his tone lower. "Consider this, Watson. Miss Fenwick believed herself in danger. She arranged her room for privacy, locked her door, and kept that cursed vial close at hand. The candle burned beside her not for light, but for defense. When she saw her killer, she attempted to activate it. The reaction froze the wax, but not before it took her life as well." I stared at him. "Then you think the candle was her own doing?" "In part, but it was manipulated by another, a mind subtler and colder than hers. Someone who knew she would use the flame, and turned her own safeguard into the instrument of her death." We had reached a small square bordered by shops when a sudden sound made Holmes halt. From the alley to our right came the echo of hurried footsteps, light, quick, deliberate. Holmes's hand shot out, catching my arm. "Someone follows us," he whispered. We turned sharply, but the fog had swallowed the street. Only a shadow moved swiftly away into the mist. Holmes darted forward, his coat swirling behind him, but by the time we reached the corner, the figure was gone. "Confound it," he muttered, scanning the street. "They knew we had been to see Tregarren. Someone is watching both sides of this game." He paused, then his voice hardened. "Watson, we must return to Baker Street at once. I have an experiment to conduct." Back in our sitting room an hour later, Holmes set the mysterious vial we had retrieved from Hanover Square upon the table. "Observe, Watson," he said, striking a match. He held the flame near the vial's residue. Instantly a faint crackling sound issued forth, and a thin frost spread across the glass like living lace. The air itself seemed to shiver. "Incredible," I breathed. "It reacts as he described." Holmes nodded. "Yes, but look closer." The reaction ceases abruptly. "The composition is incomplete, altered. Someone tampered with Tregarren's formula. It was no mere accident that Miss Fenwick's candle froze instead of burning. It was sabotage." He turned away from the experiment, pacing the room. The firelight threw long shadows across the walls. "The question remains, who among them possessed both motive and means? The Colonel perhaps fearing disgrace? Lestrade dismissed the possibility too quickly. Or could there be another presence altogether, one we have yet to see?" He paused at the window, peering out into the drifting fog. "There is always a hand unseen, Watson, pulling at the edges of the web, and I intend to find it before it strikes again." He turned back toward me, his eyes gleaming with quiet determination. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "we return to Hanover Square. I must speak again with the maid who found the body. There is one question she may answer, and that answer may thaw the mystery of the frozen candlelight." The following morning dawned pale and brittle, the light weak and strained through a sky of dirty grey. Frost clung to the window panes of Baker Street, and even Mrs. Hudson's kettle whistled reluctantly, as though resenting the chill. Holmes, however, was already fully awake, pacing before the fire with the nervous energy of a man whose mind had run ahead of dawn itself. The remains of our late-night experiment still littered the table, flasks, glass tubing, and fragments of frost-coated glass that glittered faintly in the lamplight. You observed, Watson, Holmes said without preamble, that the freezing reaction ceased abruptly, despite ideal conditions for continuation? I did, I replied, buttoning my coat against the cold. You said the formula had been altered. Indeed. But note how it was altered. He held up a small scrap of notepaper covered with his spidery handwriting. The residue contained traces of a stabilizing agent, barium carbonate. It should have neutralized the compound entirely. Instead, it slowed its reaction, causing the heat absorption to focus in a confined area before extinguishing. In other words, the candle did not freeze by accident. It was engineered to freeze in that very moment. Then Miss Fenwick's death was planned with scientific precision? Planned and tested, Holmes replied grimly. Which leads me to a curious thought. What if the killer had experimented with the mixture beforehand? If so, there may exist traces of a previous test, perhaps a discarded candle or holder, showing signs of the same reaction. He caught up his hat and coat with sudden decision. Come, Watson, to Hanover Square. The streets were slick with thawing frost as we drove once more into the heart of London. The air carried the mingled scent of coal smoke and damp earth, and the faint tolling of church bells marked the late hour of morning. The colonel met us at the door, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. I had not expected you again so soon. Mr. Holmes, he said. Nor I, Colonel. But progress rarely keeps to appointments, Holmes replied lightly. I should like a brief word with your niece's maid, the one who discovered her. Of course. Mary is in the kitchen. She has been quite distraught. The maid, when brought in, was a timid young woman of about 20, her eyes red and swollen. She curtsied nervously, twisting her apron in her hands. Miss Clara was kind to me, sir, she said in a trembling voice. I'd never seen her frightened before that night. You observed fear? Holmes asked, gently but directly. Oh, yes, sir. She was pale all evening, and when I brought her chocolate to her room at 9:30, she started at every sound. She told me to bolt the window and not to leave the candle unattended. I thought it strange Miss Clara never minded the dark. What candle was that? The one on her bedside, sir. She said she meant to keep it burning through the night. I remember her saying, if the light goes out, all will be lost. I didn't understand what she meant. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Did anyone visit the house that evening, besides the colonel and yourself? The girl hesitated. No visitors, sir, but... She glanced toward the colonel, uncertain. Speak freely, Holmes encouraged. Well, sir, there was a note brought by a messenger just before supper. Miss Clara took it upstairs. She read it once, and her hands began to shake. She burned it straight away in the fire. Describe the messenger. A boy, sir. Not more than 15. Wore a dark coat and cap. I didn't see his face well. He left as soon as she took the envelope. Holmes turned slightly. Watson, recall the ashes in the grate, partly burned paper with a watermark. Thorndyke and Sons, fine stationery. If the note was written upon that paper, then it came from someone of means or pretension. Curious indeed, he resumed his questioning. Mary, after Miss Clara dismissed you that night, did you hear or see anything unusual? The maid wrung her hands. A noise, sir. About 11, I think. A faint scraping sound, like someone moving outside on the balcony. But when I looked, there was nothing. The fog was thick. I thought it might be the wind. There is a balcony outside her window. Yes, sir. It connects with the adjoining house. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then the room was not so impenetrable as we thought. The colonel looked startled. But the door was locked from the inside. Precisely, said Holmes. Yet a lock is of little consequence if one can enter and exit by other means. The balcony, Colonel, does it extend to the neighbouring property? It does, though the house next door has stood empty for months. Holmes gave a thin smile. An empty house, a frightened woman, and a message delivered on fine paper warning her not to trust. We are drawing close, Watson. He turned abruptly to the maid. One last question, Mary. Did Miss Clara ever wear a ribbon or bracelet about her wrist, perhaps of silk? Yes, sir. A blue ribbon, always tied just so. She said it was her mother's. Thank you. That will be all. When the girl had gone, Holmes requested access to the balcony. We followed him through Miss Fenwick's chamber to the frost-flecked window. The latch was secure, but Holmes opened it with care and stepped out. The cold air bit instantly at our faces. The narrow iron balcony stretched across to the adjoining house, whose windows were dark and uncurtained. Holmes crouched low, examining the railing. "Watson," he said quietly, "observe the dust along this edge. See where it has been brushed aside by something or someone climbing across. The mark is fresh. Note, too, the faint smear of grease upon the sill." Our visitor was careful but not immaculate. He moved cat-like along the ledge until he reached the border between the two houses. The brickwork there showed faint indentations where a rope or cord had rubbed against the stone. Holmes touched it with his gloved fingers. A line was fastened here recently. The discoloration is too new to be natural. Someone descended or ascended by this route within the past 48 hours. He straightened suddenly, eyes narrowing toward the silent house next door. "Watson, I must see what lies beyond that door. There is more to this empty residence than meets the eye." We descended and persuaded the colonel to summon his steward, who possessed the key to the adjoining property, for both houses were under the same estate. The interior, when we entered, was stale and chill, smelling faintly of dust and neglect. Holmes led the way through barren rooms, his lantern sweeping the darkness. On the second floor, directly opposite Miss Fenwick's chamber, he stopped. The floorboards bore a series of footprints, some faint, others sharp. He knelt, measuring one with his hand. "A man of slight build," he murmured, "wore shoes with half-inch heels and a narrow toe, city-made. Not the colonel's size, certainly. Watson, see here, an empty candlestick." He lifted it carefully from the floor. Its waxy residue gleamed faintly in the lantern light. "Good heavens," I said. "Another candle." "Precisely. And note, the same solidified wax frozen in mid-drip. Our phantom chemist has paid this place a visit." He rose slowly, eyes distant with calculation. "He used this house as a vantage point. He watched Miss Fenwick from across the balcony, lured her into fear with the note, and perhaps even observed her light the candle herself. The means of death were hers, but the intent was his." I stared at the darkened window across the gap, its frosted glass faintly reflecting our lantern's glow. "But who would commit such a crime, Holmes? And why torment her so?" Holmes's voice was low and measured. "Because, my dear Watson, fear is often more exquisite to the cruel than the act itself. Whoever orchestrated this wished her to die believing she had brought it upon herself. That is artistry of a most malignant sort." He turned sharply toward the door, his gaze fixed, his mind evidently leaping ahead. "There remains one final piece yet unseen, the messenger boy. Find the boy, and we find the hand that guided him." As we stepped once more into the winter dusk, Holmes drew his coat close around him and murmured, "The game grows colder, Watson, but not yet frozen. The candle's flame may have died, but the fire behind it still burns somewhere in London. And when it burns again, we shall be there to see what light it casts." Holmes's eyes glittered like shards of ice as he crouched beside the broken candle on the bureau. The flickering gaslight caught the sharp planes of his face, lending him the aspect of a hawk poised before striking. He extended a long forefinger toward the congealed wax that had dripped over the edge of the mahogany. "Watson," he murmured, "note the direction of these wax trails. They fall not vertically, but at an angle of nearly 30 degrees to the surface. That indicates the candle was tilted, though the base itself remains level. Someone moved it just so while it burned. And as you can see here, the wick has been cleanly snipped rather than extinguished. A deliberate act, and one performed by steady hands." I leaned in, squinting to discern the minute details. "Surely that could have been done by anyone wishing to hide the light quickly," I suggested. "Indeed," Holmes replied softly, "but not everyone would trouble to cut the wick with surgical precision. This was no panicked gesture. It was calculated." He straightened abruptly, the hem of his dressing gown brushing the carpet. "Our visitor last night, Mrs. Fairbourne, told us that her late husband worked in metallurgy, did she not?" "She did." "You think his occupation bears upon the matter?" Holmes's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. "I think everything bears upon the matter, my dear fellow. Every candle leaves a shadow, and every shadow conceals a truth. We had returned that morning to the Fairbourne residence at Holmes's insistence. The frost upon the street still lingered, crunching beneath our boots, and our breath came out in white plumes as we ascended the steps. Inspector Lestrade awaited us within, his face pinched with impatience and cold. "I've half a mind to close this case, Mr. Holmes," said he curtly. "The coroner's report shows the man died of heart failure. There's no evidence of struggle, no forced entry, and nothing stolen. If you'll pardon me, it's hardly worth Scotland Yard's time." Holmes merely adjusted his gloves. "A pity, Lestrade. You are so anxious to reach the end that you've neglected to consider the beginning." Lestrade's brows knit. "The beginning?" "The moment when the candle was lit," Holmes said gravely. "Tell me, did you notice anything unusual about its remains?" The inspector shrugged. "Only that it had burned halfway through." "Precisely," said Holmes. "And yet the pool of wax beneath suggests it had been burning for nearly 2 hours. A curious discrepancy, don't you think?" Lestrade frowned, his irritation yielding to unease. "I can't say I follow." "You rarely do," Holmes murmured almost kindly. "Come, Watson." We followed Holmes into the adjoining study, a cold, spacious room filled with cabinets and heavy tomes. Papers were strewn across the desk, alongside a small brass crucible blackened by soot. Holmes moved among them, silent as a shadow, examining each surface without disturbing a thing. His gaze lingered upon a single slip of paper tucked beneath a glass weight. "Ah," he breathed. "The missing note." I peered over his shoulder. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unmistakably masculine. It read, "The fire will reveal what words cannot. Meet me by the river at 11:30. Bring the sample, no signature." "Good Lord," I muttered. "A rendezvous. Could this not have been some clandestine meeting for business?" Holmes's expression darkened. "Possibly. But note the phrasing. The fire will reveal what words cannot. A chemist's metaphor, Watson. Or perhaps a warning." He replaced the paper and crossed to the window. Frost had formed intricate crystals upon the glass, obscuring the view beyond. Holmes breathed lightly against it, clearing a patch through which we could see the courtyard below. "Footprints," he murmured. 2 sets. One departing, one returning. Both made before dawn and both by the same person. The heel depth tells us the man carried more weight returning than when he left. "Carried something?" I asked. "Or someone," Holmes replied. "Either possibility disturbs me." At that moment Mrs. Fairbairn entered, pale and trembling, her hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a whisper, "I have remembered something. The night before his death, my husband received a telegram. It upset him dreadfully, though he said nothing to me of its contents. I found it later, torn in half." Holmes's head snapped toward her. "Do you still have it?" She hesitated. "Yes, but it is barely legible." Holmes extended a hand. From her reticule she produced 2 small, crumpled pieces of paper. He laid them upon the desk, fitting the halves together with delicate precision. We bent close. The telegram bore only a few words. "Candlelight failed. Proceed no further." "Remarkable," Holmes said softly. "We have now both a warning and an omen. Tell me, madam, who besides your husband knew of his work in metallurgy?" "Only his partner, Mr. Redmayne," she replied. "And perhaps Lord Brackenhurst, who financed their experiments. But I cannot imagine either wishing him harm." Holmes gave her a look of sympathy mingled with calculation. "Imagination is often the enemy of truth, Mrs. Fairbairn. Facts are our only friends." He turned abruptly to me. "Watson, we shall call upon Mr. Redmayne this afternoon. Bring your revolver." Lestrade started. "You expect trouble?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "I expect logic to lead us precisely where trouble waits." The visit to Redmayne's laboratory later that day was as grim as the winter sky above. The place lay on the outskirts of Lambeth, hemmed in by blackened factories and the dull gleam of the Thames. Smoke hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid tang of chemicals. A lone assistant led us through corridors reeking of sulphur and oil, until we reached a wide chamber filled with furnaces and instruments. Redmayne himself, a gaunt man with sunken eyes, stood beside a bench, adjusting a crucible with a pair of tongs. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted us, his tone cautious. "I had heard you were investigating poor Fairbairn's death." "A tragedy indeed." Holmes inclined his head. "Tragedy, yes. Though I sometimes find that tragedies are merely crimes poorly staged. Tell me, sir, what did you and Mr. Fairbairn work upon?" "A refinement process for industrial alloys," Redmayne replied swiftly. "Harmless enough." Holmes moved closer to a nearby furnace, peering into the faintly glowing coals. "And yet, this harmless process required correspondence marked by secrecy and warnings about candlelight." Redmayne stiffened. "You've seen the telegram?" Indeed. And the note mentioning fire. Holmes's voice dropped, his tone almost conversational. You'll forgive my curiosity, but what substance were you refining that required testing by flame and candle? Redmayne's eyes flickered toward the furnace, then back to Holmes. An experimental compound. Nothing dangerous, merely unstable. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Unstable in what sense? The man hesitated. It reacts to certain metals. That is all I shall say. Very prudent, said Holmes quietly, and yet not prudent enough. You see, Mr. Redmayne, your partner's death has all the hallmarks of a chemical experiment gone wrong, save for one thing. There were no burns, no residue, and the candle beside his body had been deliberately cut short. The flame was not extinguished by accident. It was murdered. A bead of sweat traced its way down Redmayne's temple. You are mistaken, he said hoarsely. Fairborn, he was ill. His heart. Holmes stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with that predatory calm I knew so well. If his heart failed, it was frightened into silence. The question is, by what, or by whom? For a long moment, no one spoke. The furnaces hissed and crackled. Then, faintly, from the adjoining corridor, there came a soft metallic clatter, as of something dropped by trembling fingers. Holmes's head turned sharply. Watson, he said in a low voice, that was no accident. We are not alone. Holmes froze at once, every line of his body tense and listening. The faint sound of the metallic clatter still echoed down the dimly lit corridor beyond the laboratory door. I saw his sharp profile silhouetted against the furnace's dull glow, and in that moment he seemed less man than machine, alert, calculating, attuned to every vibration in the air. Without a word he raised one gloved hand, signaling me to extinguish the nearest lamp. The room plunged into a half-gloom, lit only by the red embers of the furnace and the pale, flickering tongues of gaslight from the corridor. Holmes moved forward noiselessly, his step lighter than I had ever known it. I followed close behind, my revolver already drawn. Redmayne, visibly shaken, stood motionless beside the workbench, his hands trembling over a crucible. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. It must be my assistant, Mr. Holmes. Perhaps he dropped something. Holmes's reply came like the strike of a flint. Your assistant wears boots that creak at the heel. The sound we heard was softer, metal on stone. Remain precisely where you are, Mr. Redmayne. We crept to the door. The corridor beyond stretched long and narrow, lit by a single swinging lamp. Shadows leapt and trembled upon the brick walls. Halfway down a doorway stood ajar, and in that gap I caught a glimpse of movement, a fleeting glint perhaps of glass or metal. Holmes advanced swiftly, his lean form merging with the darkness. A moment later, there came a startled cry and the sound of a struggle. I rushed forward, revolver ready, only to find Holmes standing over a man pinned against the wall by the collar of his coat. The captive was young, disheveled, his face streaked with soot. Holmes regarded him coolly. Ah, the elusive assistant. You move with commendable stealth, my good fellow, though your nerves betray you. What was it you dropped? A vial, perhaps. The man's eyes darted wildly. I wasn't spying. I swear it. I only wanted... To listen, Holmes interrupted, which is generally the act of one who has much to fear or much to hide. Now, my friend, let us see what object warranted your trembling. He bent down and retrieved a small glass tube that had rolled to the edge of the corridor. Holding it up to the light, he examined it closely. Inside was a residue of faintly shimmering dust, pale grey, almost silver in hue. Holmes's brows lifted with interest. Fascinating, he murmured. Mercuric amalgam, if my eyes do not deceive me. And yet there is something else, some trace of crystalline matter mixed within, a byproduct perhaps of your employer's so-called harmless refinement process? The assistant paled. Please, sir, I don't know. Mr. Redmayne forbade me to touch the samples. He said they were unstable, that a single spark might... Holmes's tone sharpened. Explode? The man hesitated, then nodded miserably. A thin smile curved Holmes's lips. Then it seems the good Mr. Redmayne has been experimenting not merely in alloys, but in the chemistry of peril itself. We escorted the assistant back to the laboratory, where Redmayne awaited us. He had regained some composure, but his face was ashen under the gaslight. Holmes placed the vial upon the table between them. Your man has just admitted that this compound is volatile. Shall we assume that your partner died while handling it? Redmayne's fingers gripped the edge of the bench until his knuckles whitened. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes," he said in a strained voice. "We were on the verge of a discovery that could have changed industry forever. An alloy of extraordinary strength, created through a reaction of mercury, with trace elements under controlled combustion." But Fairbairn grew frightened. He wished to halt our work. He believed it unethical. "Unethical," Holmes repeated softly. "A convenient word when one's conscience becomes an obstacle. I swear to you I never meant him harm," Redmayne said quickly. "He came here the night before he died, alone. I was not present." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Yet the footprints outside his study tell a different tale. 2 sets, Mr. Redmayne, one departing, one returning. You accompanied him home, did you not?" The man's mouth opened, then closed again. Sweat gleamed at his temples. He asked me to. He was agitated. I only wanted to ensure his safety." Holmes's voice dropped, almost kind. "And when he grew certain that your experiment had crossed the threshold of safety, you feared exposure. Perhaps there was a quarrel. Perhaps in the heat of anger, a candle was knocked aside. But what followed, Mr. Redmayne? What secret demanded that you cut that candle short and leave your partner lifeless beside its frozen flame?" Redmayne's composure broke. He turned away, pressing a hand to his brow. "You don't understand," he whispered. "He wasn't supposed to die. I only meant to frighten him, to make him see reason. The compound, we stored a small sample in a silver phial. When exposed to open flame, it gives off a vapor, harmless in trace, but, oh God, perhaps he inhaled too much of it." Holmes's eyes hardened. "So the candle was both lure and weapon." Redmayne looked up, anguish twisting his features. "I returned after he was gone. I saw him lying there, already cold. I cut the candle to make it seem deliberate, a man ending his own life. I thought it would spare his name." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Even the hiss of the furnaces seemed to fade. At last Holmes spoke, his tone measured and distant. "You tampered with the truth, sir, and nearly with justice. Your partner's death was the result of your recklessness, though not perhaps of your malice. Still, the law will draw its own conclusions." Redmayne sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. Lestrade, who had stood silent until now, cleared his throat roughly. "By heaven, Holmes, that's as queer a case as I've ever seen. So it was an accident, after all." "An accident born of pride," Holmes replied. "A flame misused, a candle cut short, a partnership dissolved by the smallest of chemical misjudgments. Tell me, Lestrade, does that strike you as anything less than murder of the intellect, if not of the body?" The inspector frowned, clearly uncertain how to answer. Holmes turned toward me, his expression suddenly weary. "Watson, we have learned once again that man's ambition burns brighter than his wisdom. Come, we must see Mrs. Fairbairn before the constabulary arrives. She deserves the truth, however cold." Outside, the evening fog had thickened into a pale mist, curling through the streets like ghostly smoke. Holmes walked in silence, his collar turned up against the chill. At last he said quietly, "You see, my dear Watson, the flame of discovery and the flame of destruction are but twin reflections of the same candlelight. The difference lies only in the hand that holds the match." I glanced at him, but he had already turned his gaze toward the river, where faint ripples caught the dim glow of gas lamps. The mystery of the frozen candlelight had been solved, yet its echo lingered in Holmes's voice, a somber melody that spoke of human folly and the fragile line between brilliance and ruin. The fog thickened as we approached Baker Street, swallowing the gaslights and dimming the clatter of distant carriages until London itself seemed to dissolve into smoke. Holmes had spoken little since we left Redmayne's laboratory. His gaze was distant, his thoughts drawn inward, and I knew better than to disturb the intricate machinery of his mind when it worked in silence. Yet there was something unsettled in his manner, a restlessness that did not accompany cases neatly closed. At last, as we neared our familiar doorstep, he spoke. "Watson, you will forgive me if I say that we have concluded nothing." I stopped short. "Nothing." "My dear Holmes," Redmayne confessed, "the evidence aligns perfectly. Fairbairn's death, though unintentional, was the result of his colleague's recklessness. What more remains?" Holmes turned toward me, and even in the mist I could see the sharp glint of skepticism in his eyes. "Confession, Watson, is a fragile foundation upon which to build truth. Redmayne's words explain what occurred, but not how it occurred. His account fills the air with sentiment and regret, but it leaves the core of the event untouched. Why, for instance, was there no residue of combustion in the study? Why did the candle's angle suggest movement after Fairborn was already dead? And above all, what became of the sample he was meant to deliver that night? Before I could reply, he ascended the steps and threw open our door. Mrs. Hudson, startled by the sudden entrance, peered from the hallway. Holmes offered her only a brief nod before striding to the sitting room, where the fire had burned low. He moved to the mantelpiece, lit a match, and held it to a candle identical to the one we had found beside Fairborn's body. As the flame steadied, he regarded it with an expression that mingled fascination and disdain. "Observe, Watson," he said, "the candle, the simplest of human inventions. It gives light and consumes itself in the process. Yet in this case I believe the candle gave something more." He reached for his magnifying lens, adjusting it over the dancing flame. When Redmayne spoke of a reaction sensitive to metal, I thought it a metaphor. But now I wonder, what if the compound reacts not merely to touch, but to reflection? I frowned. Reflection? You mean light? Precisely. A certain alignment of light, heat, and containment might trigger a silent transformation. You recall the telegram, "Candlelight failed." Proceed no further. If the compound was rendered inert without the presence of this particular flame, then the candle itself may have been designed to control the reaction. He leaned forward, eyes bright with discovery. "Watson, Fairborn's death may not have been accidental nor entirely chemical. It may have been deliberate sabotage, engineered through the very element meant to sustain the experiment." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog. But who would possess such knowledge, Holmes? Only Redmayne and Fairborn themselves. Holmes's mouth tightened. Or one who profited from their failure. Recall the name Mrs. Fairborn mentioned, Lord Brackenhurst. A financier, yes, but also a man of peculiar influence in the industrial circles of London. It is not impossible that he sought to acquire their process for himself, should one of them falter. Redmayne's remorse may be genuine, but it is possible he too was a pawn. He extinguished the candle with a swift motion, then rose and began pacing. We shall test that hypothesis tonight. The matter is not yet ended. If my instincts are correct, the true key lies not in Fairborn's laboratory, but in the missing sample he was to bring to the river meeting. I would wager that Brackenhurst possesses it even now. Before dawn broke, we found ourselves once more upon the streets of London, bound for Brackenhurst's residence in Belgravia. The grand mansion loomed through the mist like a fortress carved from marble and arrogance. Its iron gate stood open, and 2 constables stationed outside saluted Holmes with wary recognition. Inside, Lord Brackenhurst awaited us in a richly appointed study. He was a tall man of middle years, impeccably dressed, his face composed into that fixed politeness that wealth so often breeds. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "Inspector Lestrade informed me you might call. I trust the unpleasant matter concerning Mr. Fairborn has been resolved?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Nearly, my lord. There remains, however, a small discrepancy that troubles me, one involving your lordship's investment." Brackenhurst gestured toward the hearth. "Please do sit. I assure you my dealings with those men were entirely proper. I funded their research, yes, but I had no hand in their operations." The compound they were developing was to be patented jointly once completed. "And the sample that Mr. Fairborn was to bring to you?" Holmes asked mildly. "It has not, I assume, reached your possession?" A flicker, barely perceptible, passed across Brackenhurst's face. "No," he said. "I was to meet him that evening by the river, but he failed to appear." "A pity," Holmes smiled faintly. He closed the folder with a decisive snap, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and dread. "Make no plans for the coming days, Watson. The alchemist has returned to his furnace, and we must follow the trail before the city burns with a light colder and deadlier than any candle." And as the clock struck midnight, I saw in the dim reflection of the window the faint outline of Holmes's face, half in shadow, half in flame, like a man already staring into the inferno that awaited him. The following morning dawned grey and soundless, London shrouded in a mist so thick that even the cabmen cursed under their breath as they groped their way through the ghostly streets. Holmes had not slept. I found him still at his desk, the lamp burning low, surrounded by papers strewn in a precise but chaotic order only he could comprehend. His expression bore that curious mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration which always marked the threshold of revelation. "Watson," he said without preamble, "the alchemist's reappearance confirms my worst suspicion. This is no isolated act of vengeance or greed. It is a continuation of an older design, one that began long before the unfortunate death of Fairborn." He gestured toward an open dossier spread before him. "Observe these records. A series of unexplained laboratory fires over the past decade, each tied, directly or indirectly, to men of science whose work touched upon the transformation of matter or energy. All perished, all by supposed accident, and in each case the final communication they received bore the same ciphered mark, a black sigil resembling the Ouroboros, the serpent consuming its own tail. I leaned closer and saw the faint ink impression of the symbol upon one of the recovered scraps of correspondence. The line work was delicate, almost artistic, but unmistakably sinister. "And you believe this? Organization or individual is eliminating those who venture too near its secrets." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "But it is not merely suppression, Watson. It is recruitment. The alchemist does not merely destroy, he selects. When a mind of sufficient brilliance emerges, he tests it. If they resist, they perish. If they comply, they vanish, absorbed into his hidden circle. Fairborn was approached and refused, hence his death. Brackenhurst, seduced by ambition, played his role without realizing whose hand guided him. And now, with both men removed from the board, the alchemist moves unchallenged toward whatever culmination he seeks. Before I could inquire further, there came a brisk knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her usual composure visibly unsettled. "There's a gentleman below, Mr. Holmes. Insists upon seeing you at once. Says it's a matter of life and death." Holmes exchanged a glance with me, then nodded. "Show him up." A moment later, a tall, thin man in a heavy traveling coat entered, his boots thick with the grime of country roads. His hair was unkempt, his face drawn, and his hands trembled as he removed his gloves. "Mr. Holmes," he stammered, "my name is Dr. Percival Trent of the Royal Institute. I have come to you because I believe I am being followed." "Pray be seated," Holmes said gently, motioning him to a chair. "Who follows you, Dr. Trent?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window as though expecting to see someone lurking beyond the fog. "I cannot say. For the past week I have seen the same figure near my lodgings in Bloomsbury, a man with a grey scarf and a cane, always at a distance. 2 nights ago I received a letter, unsigned but with a symbol drawn in black ink. It said, 'The circle awaits its completion.' I burnt it immediately, but since then I have not slept in peace." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharp and searching. "What is your field of study, Dr. Trent?" "I am a chemist, though recently my work has turned toward photonic reactions. My latest paper concerned a method of generating heatless illumination through controlled phosphorescence." I saw Holmes's fingers tighten upon the armrest of his chair. "Heatless illumination," he murmured. "A continuation of Fairborn's line of research. The pattern holds." Trent looked bewildered. "You mean to say I am not the first?" Holmes stood abruptly. "No, Doctor, you are the next. And if we act swiftly, perhaps the last." He turned to me. "Watson, fetch your revolver and coat. We accompany Dr. Trent to his lodgings at once. The alchemist has already marked him, and if I read the rhythm of these events correctly, the next move will come before nightfall." We traveled through the thickening fog in tense silence. Trent's residence proved to be a narrow brick building on a quiet street off Russell Square. Inside, the laboratory was a maze of glass retorts and metal apparatus, the air tinged with the scent of phosphorus and oil. Holmes examined the premises with swift, practiced efficiency, his eyes missing nothing: the unlatched window, the faint smudge upon the sill, the nearly imperceptible indentation of boots upon the carpet near the door. "He has been here," Holmes said softly. "And recently." Trent swallowed hard. "Good heavens, while I was gone." Holmes knelt near the window, drawing a small shard of glass from beneath the curtain. He held it up to the light. "Not broken from within, but placed. See the residue? A fine crystalline powder. Mercuric oxide, perhaps laced with arsenic. A contact poison. Had you closed this window carelessly, you would have been dead within the hour." The man's face blanched. You mean he intended to kill me here?" "Undoubtedly. But note the precision of it. Not a crude attempt, an execution masked as misadventure. The alchemist's methods are always elegant. At that moment, a faint sound reached us from the stairwell. The creak of a tread, cautious but unmistakable. Holmes's hand motioned for silence. He moved to the doorway like a shadow, every muscle poised. I followed, revolver drawn, my pulse hammering in my ears. The steps paused, then resumed, so softly that for a moment I thought I imagined them. Suddenly Holmes flung the door wide, and the dim shape of a man froze upon the landing, half obscured by fog drifting through the open window at the corridor's end. "Stay where you are!" Holmes's voice cut through the air like a blade. But the intruder reacted with astonishing speed, darting down the stairwell. Holmes was after him in an instant, his long legs taking the steps two at a time. I followed, the sound of boots echoing against the narrow walls. The chase spilled out into the street, where the fog had thickened into an impenetrable white sea. For a moment I caught the glint of the man's cane ahead. Then he vanished into the mist as if the city itself had swallowed him whole. Holmes stopped, breathing hard, his eyes scanning the empty street. He knew the terrain. No random stalker, an agent, well-trained. The alchemist never acts without precision. He turned sharply toward me. "Watson, we must move Trent somewhere safe. But first search his correspondence. There will be another letter, one not yet read." Back at the laboratory, Holmes went straight to the desk and began sifting through papers. Within moments he extracted an unopened envelope from beneath a pile of receipts. Without hesitation he slit it open. Inside lay a single card, its edges burned, the writing neat and deliberate. "Light without heat is death without decay. The circle draws near." Holmes stared at the words for a long moment, then set the card down with quiet finality. "There can be no doubt now. The alchemist is preparing a demonstration, one that will make Fairborn's death seem but a prelude." He looked toward the darkened window, his profile illuminated by the faint blue shimmer of Trent's phosphorescent lamps. "Watson," he said, "before this night is over, London may bear witness to a spectacle of light unlike any the world has seen, and to a darkness that may never lift. And in that instant, though I could not yet see the shape of what awaited us, I felt the chill certainty that the true heart of this case lay not in the laboratories of men, but in the obsessions of a mind that had learned to turn science itself into a weapon of design and deceit. The fog outside deepened until it pressed against the window panes like a living thing, muffling all trace of the city beyond. The three of us, Holmes, Trent, and I, remained in the dim laboratory, the blue phosphorescent lamps casting cold halos of light upon our faces. Holmes stood at the window, motionless, his silhouette sharp against the pale glow. Every few moments he would drum his long fingers against the glass, his mind evidently threading together pieces of the puzzle that still eluded me. Trent sat hunched on a stool, his eyes darting between us. He looked less a man of science now, and more a frightened patient awaiting a surgeon's verdict. "Mr. Holmes," he whispered, "what do they want of me?" "I have no connection to this alchemist you speak of." "I have done nothing," Holmes turned sharply. "On the contrary, Doctor, you have done everything. You have produced that which every charlatan, mystic, and fraud since Paracelsus has dreamed of, light without heat. Do you not see? It is the perfect symbol of life without soul. You have stumbled upon his creed made manifest. I never intended—" "No," Holmes interrupted, his voice suddenly softer. "Few men of science intend to conjure evil. Yet intention is rarely the measure of consequence. The alchemist seeks not gold nor fame, but transcendence. He believes the boundary between life and death can be dissolved, as you dissolved energy from flame. To him, your discovery is scripture. The sound of a distant clock chiming through the fog drew all eyes toward the window. Midnight. Holmes checked his watch and gave a small nod. He will make his move now. How can you be certain? I asked. Because, Watson, the alchemist has always acted by ritual. The letters, the symbols, the precision of time, all point to a mind governed by pattern. Midnight, the turning of one day into another, is his moment of transformation. At that instant there came a faint metallic click from somewhere within the room. Holmes's eyes flashed. Down! He barked, and he flung himself forward, dragging Trent to the floor. A moment later, a hiss like escaping steam filled the air, followed by a sudden burst of white light. The phosphorescent lamp nearest the door exploded, showering the walls with sparks. I shielded my face, coughing as acrid smoke spread through the room. When it cleared, I saw Holmes already on his feet, examining the shattered lamp. He picked up a small fragment of metal with his tweezers, holding it beneath the flickering gaslight. A timing mechanism, he murmured. Crude but effective. Designed to overload the phosphor compound at a precise moment. Trent was trembling uncontrollably. Good God, if that had ignited, it would not have killed you, Holmes said evenly. It would have blinded you. The alchemist does not waste talent. He cripples it to serve his purpose. Come, Watson, we can tarry here no longer. We left the house through the rear alley, the cold fog swallowing us whole. Holmes led the way with swift, purposeful strides. He is drawing us toward him, he said. Each step we take, each danger we avert, he has anticipated. There is only one way to meet such a mind, by stepping beyond its design. And how do you propose to do that? I asked. By doing the one thing he cannot predict, by striking first. We reached Baker Street as dawn began to grey the edges of the fog. Holmes wasted no time. He gathered his notes, the ciphered letters and the shards from the lamp, spreading them across the table as though arranging pieces on a chessboard. Observe, he said, motioning for me to look. The Ouroboros symbol is not a mere emblem, it is a map. Each curve corresponds to a district of London. The letters we have recovered, each sent from a different point, form the full circle. And where the head meets the tail, there, Watson, lies our adversary. I bent closer. Whitechapel, I said quietly. Of course, indeed. The alchemist hides not in splendor but in decay. Genius often retreats to the shadows it seeks to master. Holmes's expression hardened. Tonight, we end it. By the time evening fell, the city was again cloaked in its wintry shroud. We ventured eastward through narrow streets that twisted like veins through the heart of London's underworld. Holmes carried no weapon save his walking stick, and that peculiar calm which made him, in moments of peril, seem carved from stone. I followed close behind, revolver in hand, every sense strained. Our destination was a derelict apothecary's shop, its windows long boarded, its sign faintly visible through the grime. Holmes examined the lock by the weak light of his lantern. Repaired recently, he noted. Someone tends this ruin with care. He pressed a slender pick into the keyhole, and within seconds the door yielded with a soft click. The interior was pitch dark. We entered cautiously, the boards creaking beneath our feet. A faint chemical odor hung in the air, something metallic mingled with burnt sugar. Holmes moved ahead, his lantern sweeping over shelves laden with glass jars, rusted instruments, and the withered remains of herbs. Then the light caught something that made my blood run cold, a figure standing at the far end of the room, motionless, head bowed as though in prayer. Holmes raised the lantern higher. It was no man but a mannequin, fashioned from wax, dressed in a tattered coat, and bearing a striking resemblance to Dr. Trent. Its chest was hollowed, and inside lay a nest of wires connected to a small ticking device. "Move back," Holmes cried. We barely cleared the threshold before a violent flash filled the shop, followed by the roar of an explosion that shook the windows of the surrounding street. When the smoke cleared, the apothecary was in ruins, flames licking at the broken timbers. Holmes coughed but managed a grim smile. He expected us. The trap was perfect, too perfect. He wished to erase us and leave Trent alive, pliant, afraid. Which means... He paused, his eyes narrowing. Which means the true confrontation lies elsewhere. Where? I managed to ask, still dazed. Holmes turned toward the east, where a faint glow had begun to rise above the fog. There, he said softly, the old chemical works by the river. It was Fairborn's last project, unfinished, abandoned after his death. The alchemist will not let it go to waste. We found the works an hour later, its brick chimneys jutting like blackened fingers against the fog. Within, a single light burned, cold, steady, unnatural. As we approached, I realized it was no ordinary flame, but a sphere of phosphorescence suspended in a glass chamber, pulsing with a rhythm that felt almost alive. A figure stood beside it. He was tall, draped in a heavy cloak, his face obscured by a hood. When he spoke, his voice was calm, resonant, disturbingly familiar. "You are late, Mr. Holmes." Holmes stepped forward, unflinching. "And you are predictable, Professor." The man lowered his hood, revealing a face I recognized with a start. It was Brackenhurst, the assistant we had presumed dead in the earlier fire. Yet there was something altered in his expression, a serenity bordering on madness. "I have transcended death," he said simply. "You cannot kill what has already become light." Holmes's tone was cuttingly calm. "You have become nothing more than a reflection of your own delusion. You sought to perfect what you could not comprehend. Fairborn's discovery was never yours to weaponize." Brackenhurst smiled faintly. "And yet you came to see it, to witness the dawn of a new age." He gestured toward the pulsing light. "This is the frozen candlelight, the culmination of all that men of reason denied. In a moment it shall illuminate the city, and every soul who beholds it shall see as I see, pure energy freed from decay." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the mechanism. "And destroy every living thing within a mile radius," he said. "Your purity is annihilation." I saw then that his hand had slipped inside his coat, withdrawing a small vial. With a movement so swift I scarcely perceived it, he hurled it toward the base of the chamber. The glass shattered, and the air filled with a hiss of vapor. The glowing sphere flickered, dimmed, then died with a faint sigh, as though extinguished by some unseen breath. Brackenhurst stared, stunned. "What have you done?" "Neutralized your catalyst," Holmes replied coldly. "Phosphorescence is a jealous mistress. It cannot abide interference." The man lunged forward with a cry, but Holmes caught his wrist, twisting sharply. They struggled only for an instant, before Brackenhurst wrenched free and stumbled backward toward the dark river beyond the open archway. For a fleeting second, his face was lit by the last ember of the fading light, and then he was gone, swallowed by the fog. Holmes stood motionless, staring after him. "Thus ends the alchemist," he said quietly. Consumed by the same element he worshipped, we remained there in silence, the echo of the river mingling with the faint crackle of dying light. When at last Holmes turned to me, his expression was unreadable. "Watson," he murmured, "there are moments when victory feels perilously akin to loss. Remember that." And as we stepped back into the London fog, I could not help but feel that somewhere, deep beneath that shifting grey sea of smoke and silence, a spark yet lingered, cold, waiting, hand unwilling to die. For a long moment after Brackenhurst vanished into the fog, neither Holmes nor I moved. The silence of the riverbank was so complete that even the lapping of the water seemed hushed, as though London itself held its breath. Then Holmes straightened, brushing a trace of soot from his sleeve, and his expression, though calm, betrayed a weight that even he could not wholly conceal. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "There is still work to be done." We retraced our steps through the abandoned works, the dim glow of my lantern revealing twisted girders and scorched remnants of machinery. The once brilliant sphere of the frozen candlelight had left behind a residue of silvery dust that clung to the floor like frost. Holmes knelt to examine it, his magnifying lens flashing briefly in the weak light. "Mercuric sublimate," he murmured, "with traces of phosphor and silver nitrate. A delicate mixture, unstable, reactive, and most certainly beyond the capacities of any sane chemist to employ in such quantity." He rose, pocketing a sample. "It confirms what I feared. Brackenhurst's transformation was not philosophical, it was chemical. The very substance he worshipped consumed his mind as surely as it sought to consume matter itself. We left the factory as dawn began to creep across the horizon, the fog thinning to reveal the cold glimmer of the Thames. A constable's whistle shrilled somewhere in the distance, but the streets near the river remained deserted. Holmes hailed a cab, and we rode in silence back toward Baker Street. I could see from his drawn features that the night's events had taxed even his formidable reserves. When we reached our sitting room, Holmes removed his coat and threw himself into his chair before the hearth. The faint morning light slanted through the curtains, catching the edges of the violin that lay upon the mantel. I busied myself with the kettle, for the simple comfort of tea seemed the only sane response to a night steeped in madness. At length, Holmes spoke. "Watson, do you recall what Brackenhurst said before his end? You cannot kill what has already become light." It was the utterance of a fanatic, and yet it holds a peculiar truth. Energy never dies, it merely changes form. So too, perhaps, with the obsessions of men. I looked up from my cup. "You believe he survived?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "I believe only in evidence. Yet there are matters beyond the reach of deduction. The river may have claimed him, or it may not. Until his body is found, we can claim neither victory nor closure." Before I could respond, there came a brisk knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her usual composure replaced by a touch of alarm. "A letter for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, handing him an envelope. "No messenger, just found upon the step." Holmes's brows knit as he examined it. The seal bore no mark, but the paper carried that faint scent of ozone and metal I had come to associate with the alchemist's handiwork. He broke it open with care. Inside lay a single folded page. I watched his expression as he read, and a slow, grim smile touched his lips. Without a word, he passed it to me. The message was brief, written in the same precise hand we had seen before. "The circle is not broken, merely expanded. What was frozen shall burn anew. Look to the stars, Mr. Holmes, they are my next crucible." I felt a chill trace my spine. "He lives, then?" Holmes's tone was almost detached. "Or someone continues his work." The alchemist was always more an idea than a man, an idea that survives by inhabiting the ambitious and the unguarded. There will always be another to take up the torch. He rose, pacing before the fire. "But note the phrase, Watson, look to the stars. It is both literal and metaphorical. Perhaps he intends an experiment involving celestial projection, or an observatory, or simply seeks to suggest that his reach has grown. Either way, he challenges us still." For several minutes he walked in silence, the rhythmic sound of his steps mingling with the crackle of the fire. Then abruptly he halted. "The Royal Observatory," he said. "Greenwich. It houses a new optical array recently acquired from Paris. Trent mentioned it in one of his papers, the same principle of phosphorescent concentration adapted to astronomical use. By heaven, Watson, that is his next stage. If he means to demonstrate his frozen candlelight on a grander scale, that device would serve perfectly. Within the hour, we were en route to Greenwich. The early morning streets were stirring now, carriages rattling through the thinning mist, chimney smoke rising in pale ribbons against the ashen sky. The journey passed in tense quiet. Holmes sat with eyes closed, lips moving faintly as though rehearsing calculations within his mind. When we arrived at the observatory gates, we were met by the head caretaker, a nervous man who confirmed that Dr. Trent had indeed visited that morning to deliver certain recovered notes from his laboratory. He seemed uneasy, the man said, but said nothing of any danger. "He went up to the main dome not half an hour ago." Holmes's expression darkened. "Come, Watson, quickly!" We climbed the spiral staircase that led to the upper chamber, our footsteps echoing against the ironwork. The door at the top stood slightly ajar. From within came a low humming sound, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Holmes pushed the door open, and we stepped into the vast circular room dominated by the great telescope. Dr. Trent was there, standing near the instrument, his face bathed in an eerie bluish light. He turned as we entered, his eyes wide with a feverish gleam. "Holmes, you were right. They reached me even here, but I have found a way to stop them." "Look," Holmes advanced cautiously. "What have you done, Trent?" The man gestured toward the lens. "I altered the light frequency. If my calculations are correct, it will neutralize the phosphorescent catalyst. But I must test it." Only a moment, so he reached for the control lever. "Trent, wait!" Holmes cried, but the warning came too late. The machine whirred, and a column of cold light burst upward, splitting through the open dome into the pale morning sky. For an instant the room was flooded with brilliance, so intense that I threw up my arm to shield my eyes. Then, as suddenly as it came, the light collapsed into darkness. When my vision cleared, Trent lay slumped against the base of the telescope, his body motionless. Holmes knelt beside him, fingers seeking a pulse. After a moment he shook his head. The light was pure, too pure. He succeeded in neutralizing it, but at the cost of his own life. We carried the poor man's body down as the first rays of the real dawn broke over the river. Outside, the city was stirring, unaware of how close it had come once again to catastrophe. Holmes stood upon the observatory steps, his gaze fixed upon the horizon, where the last faint shimmer of phosphorescence lingered. Dissolving into sunlight, at last, he said softly. The frozen candlelight is extinguished. Then, turning to me with a weary smile, and yet, Watson, I fear that somewhere in the vast laboratory of human ambition, another hand even now prepares to strike a match. I said nothing. Together we descended into the waking streets, the morning alive with the ordinary sounds of life. Carriages, laughter, the call of merchants. And as we passed once more into that familiar London bustle, I could not shake the image of that cold, perfect light, nor the thought that perhaps Holmes was right, that in every age there will always be another alchemist waiting in the dark, dreaming of the impossible flame. For several days after the affair at Greenwich, Holmes remained in an unusually reflective mood. The newspapers made much of the mysterious explosion at the Royal Observatory, but no mention was made of either Brackenhurst or his sinister creation. The official account credited the tragedy to a malfunction in Dr. Trent's apparatus, an accident of scientific overreach, swiftly forgotten amid London's daily tumult. Yet I knew better. Holmes, though outwardly tranquil, could not let the matter rest in his mind. The alchemist's shadow lingered still, faint but unmistakable. It was late one evening, nearly a week after the incident, when I found him seated at his desk, surrounded by scattered notes and chemical residues collected from the factory. His pipe lay unlit, his expression composed but distant. He spoke without looking up. Watson, the alchemist, is not dead. The certainty of his tone chilled me. You mean Brackenhurst? In part. But I refer not to the man. He has likely perished in the Thames. I mean the principle. Consider this, my dear fellow. Trent's alterations to the light frequency destroyed the compound utterly. The chain of reactions ceased. But before that instant, a measurable surge of energy escaped into the atmosphere, one which, by my calculations, was sufficient to imprint residual luminescence across a radius of several miles. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. In essence, a ghost of the frozen candlelight remains, diffused yet alive. I stared at him in disbelief. You think it can reconstitute itself? He smiled faintly, not his flame, but his knowledge. Some fragment of the formula may yet exist, in another mind, another manuscript. And therein lies the danger. Knowledge is the one contagion that never dies. His words proved prophetic. That very night, as though summoned by the thought, a small parcel arrived bearing no return address. Inside was a sealed vial containing a trace of silvery dust and a note written in the same spidery hand we had seen before. Light is only the first language of the void. The second awaits translation. Holmes regarded it long and silently. Then, with the most deliberate motion, he tossed both vial and note into the fire. The flame hissed blue for a moment, then faded. That, he said, is the only answer such invitations deserve. He rose, stretching the stiffness from his limbs, and reached for his violin. A low contemplative melody filled the room, soft, searching, yet tinged with a strange peace. For the first time in weeks I saw the tension leave his features. You see, Watson, he said between phrases, the pursuit of knowledge, when untempered by conscience, becomes an abyss. Brackenhurst looked into that abyss and mistook its reflection for enlightenment. Trent, noble soul though he was, tried to cage it. Both failed because they forgot the simplest of all scientific laws, that every illumination must cast a shadow. He set down the bow and gazed into the fire. I have devoted much of my life to unveiling the hidden mechanisms of crime, to proving that even chaos may be explained by logic. But sometimes, I confess, the logic is too vast for even me to grasp in full. There are corners of existence where reason bends. And yet, his eyes flicked toward me with a sudden glint, it is our task, yours and mine, to keep pressing forward until light and shadow stand revealed for what they are. I nodded quietly. And if the alchemist returns? Holmes smiled, faintly amused. Then we shall be here, my dear Watson, ready with lens, lantern, and logic. Evil, like the elements, is subject to discovery and control. It cannot prevail forever. Not while there are minds still curious enough to question and brave enough to oppose. The fire crackled softly, throwing its glow upon the scattered papers, the violin, the familiar outlines of our sitting room. Beyond the window, London stretched in darkness, its countless lamps gleaming through the mist like small defiant stars. I found comfort in their steady persistence, each one a testament to the fragile, enduring light Holmes spoke of, the light that no darkness could wholly consume, and thus the case of the frozen Candlelight passed into our archives, marked by Holmes in his own hand as an inquiry into the chemical madness of faith. It was never published, nor would the world ever know how near it had come to disaster that winter. But on rare nights, when the fog rolled thick and pale over Baker Street, I sometimes caught Holmes glancing toward the horizon, as if searching for some faint shimmer that might betray the return of that impossible radiance. If he ever saw it, he never said. Yet I like to believe that somewhere deep within him, Sherlock Holmes carried both the burden and the brilliance of that terrible light, a reminder that even in the most unfathomable mysteries, the truest illumination lies not in the flame itself, but in the mind that dares to study its glow. And so the case was closed.